Three New Year's Eve celebration true horror stories. Story 1. The Midnight Visitor. It was New Year's Eve in 2012, and I was at my mother's house, preparing for our family celebration. The air was rich with the scent of roasted meats and freshly baked bread, and the atmosphere buzzed with excitement. My 7-year-old son, Lucas, was the only child present that night. A curious and imaginative boy who loved playing hide-and-seek during family gatherings. The clock struck 11 p.m., and we began clearing the dining table to head outside for fireworks. The plaza was just 2 blocks away, and it had become a tradition to watch the display together as a family. As we stepped into the patio, I instinctively glanced around for Lucas. He wasn't there. He's probably hiding again, I said with a nervous laugh, though unease crept into my voice. We called his name and searched the patio, but he didn't respond. Panic set in as we scoured every room in the house, under beds, behind curtains, inside closets. But Lucas was gone. My heart raced as I imagined the worst. Could he have wandered into the street? I rushed to the front door and flung it open. There he was, standing barefoot on the porch under the dim glow of a street lamp, staring intently at something beyond my sight. "Lucas," I cried, scooping him into my arms. "What were you doing out here?" He blinked up at me with wide eyes. "I was talking to the man," he said matter-of-factly. Confused and shaken, I asked who he meant. "Mr. Alvarez?" I guessed, referring to an elderly neighbor who sometimes watched over him. "No," Lucas replied simply. "The man who said he loves you." I froze but didn't have time to press further. My brother called us back to the patio. There were only 5 minutes until midnight. Relieved that Lucas was safe, I pushed aside my questions and joined my family to welcome the new year. That night, we stayed over at my mother's house since it was too late to drive home. As dawn broke, I woke up to find Lucas rummaging through an old box of photographs in my childhood bedroom. "Look," he exclaimed excitedly, holding up a faded photo of my family at the beach decades ago. "This is him, the man I talked to last night." My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the photo. It was my father, Lucas's grandfather, who had passed away when Lucas was just 2 years old. There was no way he could have remembered him. "What did he say to you?" I whispered. "He said he loves you all very much," Lucas replied innocently, "and that he's happy he got to meet me." Tears streamed down my face as I hugged him tightly. That evening, I shared what had happened with my siblings and mother. We lit candles and said a prayer for my father's soul, feeling an odd sense of comfort despite the strangeness of it all. But that wasn't where it ended. Over the following days, strange occurrences began plaguing our home. It started subtly, doors creaking open on their own or faint whispers echoing through empty rooms at night. At first, I chalked it up to old house noises or an overactive imagination. Then Lucas began waking up at odd hours, claiming that Grandpa wanted to talk again. One night, I woke up to find him standing by his bedroom window, staring into the darkness outside. "He's here," Lucas whispered without turning around. My blood ran cold as I approached him cautiously. "Who's here?" "The man from New Year's Eve," he replied softly. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I peered out the window but saw nothing unusual, just shadows cast by swaying trees under moonlight. Yet an overwhelming sense of being watched enveloped me. In desperation, I sought help from a local priest who blessed our home and assured me that spirits sometimes linger out of love rather than malice. But even after the blessing, Lucas continued speaking of his visits with Grandpa, describing details about his life that no 7-year-old could have known. One night in mid-January, I awoke to find an old photograph, the same one Lucas had picked out on New Year's Day, lying on my bedside table despite having locked it away in storage weeks earlier. Scribbled across its back in shaky handwriting were 3 words, asterisk, "I am here," asterisk. Terrified yet unwilling to abandon my father's memory entirely, I decided to confront whatever presence lingered in our lives. One evening, I gathered my family for another prayer session, but this time included Lucas in leading it. As we prayed together by candlelight, a sudden gust extinguished every flame in the room, and for a brief moment before darkness consumed us completely, we all saw him, standing silently at the edge of our circle with tears glistening in his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward us. He simply stood there as if saying goodbye, and just like that, he was gone. From that day forward, peace returned to our home, but every New Year's Eve since then, I leave an extra chair at our table, just in case Grandpa decides to visit again. Reflection. Even now as I write this years later, part of me wonders if what we experienced was real or some shared hallucination brought on by grief and longing for closure. But deep down, I know what we saw and felt was real. And every time New Year's Eve approaches, I feel his presence again in subtle ways. A flickering candle or a faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. Some doors between worlds are meant to stay closed, but sometimes love finds a way through them anyway. Story 2. The Village That Time Forgot. It was New Year's Eve in 2012, and I was both excited and anxious as I drove down a dark highway with my girlfriend, Sophia. We were on our way to her uncle's ranch to celebrate with her extended family. It was my first time meeting most of them, and I wanted to make a good impression. But we had stayed longer than planned at my parents' house for lunch, so we left later than everyone else. The directions we'd been given were vague. Turn left at a dirt road after a certain kilometer marker, but in the pitch-black night, every turn looked the same. As the hours passed, frustration began to set in. The road narrowed, and the wilderness seemed to press in on us. The GPS signal had vanished long ago, leaving us utterly lost. "Let's just go back," Sophia suggested anxiously. "We can celebrate with your parents instead." I hesitated but eventually agreed. As I turned the car around, Sophia suddenly pointed ahead. "Wait! Look! Lights!" In the distance, faint glimmers of light pierced through the darkness. Relieved at the prospect of finding help, we drove toward them. Soon, we arrived at a small village nestled in a clearing, a picturesque place with cobblestone streets and warmly lit houses. The air was filled with laughter and music as villagers celebrated New Year's Eve. We parked near the plaza and stepped out cautiously. A group of villagers greeted us warmly, their faces glowing with joy. "Welcome," an elderly woman said cheerfully. "You must be lost. Come in and join us." Their kindness immediately put us at ease as they ushered us into one of the homes. Inside, tables were piled high with food and drinks, and children ran around playing games. The villagers insisted we eat something before continuing our journey. "We can't stay long," I said apologetically as I accepted a cup of cider. "Nonsense," said another villager with a hearty laugh. "It's bad luck to leave before midnight." Despite our initial hesitation, Sophia and I found ourselves swept up in the festivities. The villagers were remarkably kind, almost too kind, and their hospitality felt surreal. Midnight approached quickly, and after exchanging hugs and well wishes with them, I asked for directions to her uncle's ranch. "Take this road," said an older man, pointing toward a narrow path leading out of the village. "It'll get you there in no time." Grateful for their help, we left just before midnight and arrived at the ranch 20 minutes later. Her family had been worried about us, but was relieved when we finally showed up. Over dinner, we shared our strange but heartwarming encounter with the villagers. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. "We should go back," I suggested as Sophia and I walked around the ranch after breakfast. "I want to thank them properly." She agreed. So we packed some food from last night's feast as a gesture of gratitude and set off toward the village. But when we arrived at what should have been its location, there was nothing there, only crumbling ruins swallowed by overgrown vegetation. The cobblestone streets were cracked and uneven, roofs had caved in long ago, windows stared back at us like hollow eyes. "This can't be right," Sophia whispered, clutching my arm tightly. We retraced our steps but found no sign of life. Only silence broken by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. When we returned to the ranch empty-handed, Sophia's uncle listened intently as we recounted what had happened. "Ah," he said gravely after a long pause. "You must have found El Pueblo de las Sombras, the village of shadows?" I repeated uneasily. He nodded solemnly. "It used to be a thriving community decades ago, until everyone left for better opportunities in the city. But some say their spirits never left, especially on New Year's Eve." He explained that many travelers had reported similar encounters over the years, stumbling upon a lively village only to find ruins when they returned during daylight hours. "They're not harmful," he added reassuringly. "They just want to keep celebrating, even if it's only among themselves." That night back at the ranch, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying our visit to the village, the warmth of their smiles, the clinking of glasses, and something else I hadn't noticed before, how none of them cast shadows under those bright lights. At exactly midnight, I woke suddenly to faint laughter echoing outside my window. My heart pounded as I peered out into the moonlit fields beyond the ranch house and froze. In the distance were flickering lights, the same ones that had led us to El Pueblo de las Sombras. For a moment, I thought I saw figures moving among those lights, dancing shadows that beckoned me silently before vanishing into darkness once more. Every year since that night on New Year's Eve, I see those lights again from afar. They seem to call out to me like an invitation, a silent reminder that some places are never truly abandoned. And though part of me wants to go back, I know better now than to follow them again into the village that time forgot. Story 3. The Last Supper. For as long as I can remember, there's been a house at the end of our cul-de-sac that no one dared to enter. Its windows were darkened, its walls cloaked in ivy, and its silence was oppressive. The house had become a local legend, whispered about in hushed tones, especially around New Year's Eve. People said it came alive on that night, replaying the tragedy that had occurred there years ago when an entire family perished under mysterious circumstances. This year, I decided to test the legend myself. "Let's spend midnight inside," I told my friends Javier and Isabel as we gathered at my house on December 31st. "We'll prove it's just an old story." Javier hesitated, but Isabel was intrigued. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. "That place gives me the creeps." "That's the point," I replied with a grin. "It'll be fun, armed with flashlights and our phones." We made our way to the abandoned house just before midnight. The air grew colder as we approached the property. The gate creaked open as if it had been waiting for us. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but brushed it off as excitement. Inside, the house was eerily preserved. Dust-covered furniture remained in place, and faded photographs lined the walls. It was as though time had stopped on that fateful night. "Look at this," Javier said, pointing to a long dining table still set with tarnished silverware and cracked plates. "It's like they left in a hurry." I forced a laugh to mask my unease. Or maybe they never left. As we explored further, strange things began happening. The temperature dropped sharply in certain rooms, and faint whispers echoed from nowhere. "Did you hear that?" Isabel asked, clutching Javier's arm tightly. "It's just the wind," he replied unconvincingly. But then came the sound of muffled laughter, a low chuckle that sent chills down my spine. We rushed back to the dining room only to find something impossible. The table was no longer dusty or abandoned. Instead, it was laden with steaming dishes and sparkling glasses of wine, as though prepared for a grand feast. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, shadows began forming around the table, vague human shapes that flickered like candle flames. We froze as we realized what we were seeing. Ghostly figures of a family seated around the table. The apparitions were laughing and talking as if nothing were amiss, except for one figure at the head of the table who sat silently with a grim expression. His eyes seemed to pierce through time itself as they locked onto me. "Who are you?" I stammered. The figure didn't answer, but raised his glass in a mock toast before speaking in a voice that echoed like thunder. "Welcome to our celebration." Suddenly, chaos erupted around us. The ghosts began reenacting their final moments, the joyous laughter turning into screams as they clutched their throats and collapsed one by one. The figure at the head of the table remained motionless, watching them die with cold detachment. We tried to run, but every door slammed shut around us. The walls seemed to close in as ghostly hands reached out from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here," hissed a disembodied voice. Desperate, I grabbed a candelabra from the table and swung it wildly at one of the doors until it burst open. We tumbled out into the night, gasping for air as we fled down the street without looking back. When we finally stopped running, Isabel turned to me with tears streaming down her face. What did we just see?" I couldn't answer. My mind was racing with fragments of what we'd witnessed. The poison feast replaying over and over like some horrific loop. The next day, curiosity got the better of me despite my fear. I returned to find the house boarded up again, as though nothing had happened. But I knew better. I could still feel those piercing eyes watching me every time I closed my own. And every New Year's Eve since that night, I hear faint laughter echoing on the wind, a chilling reminder of the Last Supper I will never forget. If you enjoyed these real horror stories, then do subscribe to Horror Vault to watch our upcoming true horror stories. Wishing you a very happy new year.